My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive, and I'm pleased to have Harold Danko with me today, who is a pianist, composer, and professor emeritus at Eastman School of Music. And I probably left some things out, but maybe we'll get to that.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I refer to myself as a promising septuagenarian pianist. They usually apply that adjective to prodigies,
Yes.
but I'm still promising. I don't know what I'm promising.
Okay, well, you've still got a ways to go then in your own mind.
Hopefully.
Yeah. I prepared a longer than normal question here, so you'll have to put up with me for a moment. You were born in 1947.
Correct.
Okay, so in 1959, there was actually a documentary called The Year That Changed Jazz. And in that year, you had the release of Kind of Blue, Time Out, Mingus Aum, The Shape of Jazz to Come. At the same time, on the pop charts, you had Johnny Horton's The Battle of New Orleans and
Wow.
Kansas City by Wilbur Harrison. So my question is, did a 12-year-old Harold Danko take note of any of this music, and did it affect you in any particular way? If not, what did?
Well, that's about the year I really got interested in jazz. And it was thanks to I had two older brothers, both played saxophone. And so there was jazz in the house, but they were much older than me. And so they were not living at home. And I was the kid, who they would come over and we'd play some standard tunes or whatever. I didn't know much. But then my brother got one of those big stereo things and played Milestones actually. And that did it for me. I heard Milestones on a stereo with those two floor speakers. And I just heard those exchanges between Cannonball and Coltrane and whatever. And that was it. It was life-changing. It might have been right in 1959 or 60 because it had to be because Milestones Kind of Blue was just going to come out, I think. And my brother got me that record for that Christmas. So all those records you mentioned, plus the rock stuff and all the things I was listening to, Chuck Berry was, when I saw him on American Bandstand, that changed my life too. I saw that guy doing the duck walk or whatever it was. I said, that's the coolest thing. We don't do that in Maisry, Ohio, and so all those things were really influential. And not to be too long-winded about it, but in my own, my own sense of creativity or whatever, those were much more important, including the rock side of that and the jazz instrumentals that I heard than the standard repertoire, even though I was learning standard repertoire. The words didn't mean that much to me in the standard repertoire. When I hear something like "I get no kick from champagne," I didn't get it, so and I hadn't, I hadn't been to a musical or anything like that. So some of that repertoire didn't affect me as much as just, whatever Miles was doing and whatever, whatever I was hearing the instrumentalists do. And then the other side of it was because my contemporaries, I was growing up with kids that were interested in the rock, and basically, funk styles that came out. And so that was very influential. Plus, the Beatles and that sort of thing later on. The Beatles, Frank Zappa, all those things in the 60s. All my friends were into that. And I just loved it. And then the more I got interested in playing and, got into bands because I just wanted to be part of a band. That was like the greatest thing. I think when I was 15 or 16, I played a gig at an actual club and we were trying to be the John Coltrane Quartet, I think, or something, and that was just the greatest thing to be part of a band. And then I realized the value of all those standard tunes that I had kind of grown up with, because I did hear the radio and heard Sinatra and heard all these things. And once in a while I liked the tune, but like I said, the words never got to me. For me, Bob Dylan, Masters of War, got to me more, I could get into that. And that was my generation,
Yeah,
or
and
Eleanor Rigby. Those
yes,
kind of things were poetic to me.
the words sort of came from a previous generation. It probably was a good thing that at age 12 you didn't know about getting a kick from champagne, I suppose.
I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know about that
But
yet.
I think it's so terrific that the Miles LP you mentioned, it starts out so ear catching, like bup, 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 bup.
Right.
How can that not grab you?
Yeah. Especially on a big stereo,
Yeah.
it was just amazing. And then the other, there's so many, like Bop, like on the other side, Dr. Jackal, stuff that's really like, I think there's three things that are blues on the record. And then there's that Red Garland thing, Billy Boy, which he's kind of doing Ahmed Jamal, but it's with Philly Joe Jones. So,
Hmm.
that's some thrilling stuff.
Yes, indeed. Do you remember the first gig where you ever made money, and how much was it?
Absolutely. It was well, now I think of there was a couple ways. Actually, my brother Joe taught saxophone, uh, and his students would give a recital once a year. I think when I was about 13 or 14, he started paying me to accompany them. So I got money for actually trying to learn, and whatever the accompaniment parts were to these saxophone solos.
You mean
Basically intermediate kind of level. But
classical?
flight, what's that?
Was it classical?
Yeah, kind of, the whatever saxophonist study, I
Yes.
think I remember Flight of the Bumblebee, or there was something, I don't know, but he had a bunch of clarinet students. So that was the first paying gig that I had. But then that quartet gig I mentioned, which was at a real jazz club, with alcohol and actual marijuana outside in the car, and I was like 16 or something. And my dad had dropped me off to the gig. And then I realized I was in another world, in this club. And then my dad picked me up at 2:00, and like things had changed a lot. So
Yes.
2:00 in the morning. But we were playing impressions, and we were trying to do this kind of stuff. And it was pretty amazing, that feeling of being in a band and actually getting paid for playing music, because I came up in a steelworking town. My father started out in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, and he was a steel worker in Sharon, Pennsylvania. I grew up in Maysville, Ohio, just across the state line. And but my father worked in a plant, and it was a big deal to escape the mills, and so music was a way out. And my parents were very musical. My dad played the button accordion, kind of Slovak style polkas, and actually my older brother Joe played some button accordion too, but was a saxophonist and clarinetist, a music teacher by trade too.
I assume you had a piano in the house.
Yeah, my brother was finishing his college degree when I was about 5 or 6 years old.
Mm.
He was in college, and he moved a piano into our house, and there was a piano because he needed it for his for whatever you do, and to pass piano in college. So there it was, and Joe showed me middle C, and some notes, and it kind of got that from there to some lessons, and then trying to pick out tunes.
Did your father played a button accordion?
Yeah, what do they call this? Harmonium, or no?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's a button accordion with the bass has buttons. It's very, very Slavic sort of.
Okay.
Eastern European instrument.
Well, I'm wondering, when did the idea of creating music from chord changes come? When were you confronted with that?
Well, the legend in my house is that my brother Joe, early on in the swing era, because he started playing in clubs when he was about 12 or 13, back in the war years, because in the Second World War. So he started making some good money, And the legend in the house was that he traded in some of my dad's polka records for a Benny Goodman record. And so that brought jazz into the house. And there were still enough polka records laying around. But so jazz was in the house. And between my brother and Joe, who was older and very influential, but also my brother John, who played alto and was very melodic. There are some tapes I have that are very precious where John sounds kind of like Paul Desmond. I mean, he just had a natural sense of melody. And so both Joe and John were really into this standard repertoire. So there was a fake book around, or whatever, they called them fake booked in those days. And so somehow, probably Joe showed me some chords or whatever, because he was doing that. And so that's the idea of like my brothers would be coming over. And like I said, they were married by this time and out of the house, but maybe on a Saturday, they would come around and maybe on their way to a gig. And so they might need a little warm up or something. So came and ran through a couple standard tunes and, whatever it would be. And I'd be reading them, chords and root positions, whatever I knew.
Yeah.
And so that idea of playing by chords and playing by ear was around. Plus my dad was he was he wasn't not a trained musician. So he played whatever he knew by ear.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's a lot to be said for playing by ear, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really one of those things where I'm really glad I had that. I wish I had been a little more disciplined about reading because, it's one of those things where I try to hear it. I talked about, I was explaining once about, I could never be ear blind. I had to, there was a teacher when I was about 16, I went to study with a wonderful teacher named Dolores Spitzer, who had me sight read something that was on the piano. And after a couple bars, she said, "You don't read, do you?" And she said, "You try to figure it out." And I said, "It's exactly right." Like she said, "You got to just, read the next note, like the paper, like you're reading." And I just like had this concept, I just can't do it ear blind. I got to know kind of what it sounds like or how does it function, And so as I went along, I could kind of sight read Mozart. I could kind of sight read Scott Joplin, but the music that I really like is very dissonant. And so I could really had a problem reading stuff that was, I had to analyze it first, So
it sort of brings me to the question of when you have played classical music over the years, do you feel compelled to try to figure out harmonically most of the piece? Like, what is the composer doing here? I mean, I know on the past I've had little assignments where I might look at a score and go down vertically, see if I can make sense out of all the instruments. What's the chord here?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the way in my Beethoven sonatas, my teachers at college would laugh because I had everything labeled G7, and they were just they couldn't believe it. And I said, if I don't know what it is per my own understanding, because I could get through the theory classes and call it a 5-7 or whatever. But for me, it's like if it was a G7, it was a G7. And I said, that helps me to fake it if I have to. And I remember one particular jury I did where I was convinced I was going to flunk because whatever I was playing. And my teacher, Robert Hopkins, at that time at Youngstown University, said, I ended up with a B- or something. They said, "We passed you because we couldn't believe you kept going on." And and I just said, "Yeah, that's those chords. I know where I am. If I'm making every mistake, I still can track. I know where I am in the piece. That should have been an A7 there, it wasn't."
But that's so much better than stopping, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the reason that they passed. I think I would have been out of music school if I had stopped, But they had I looked at the jury and they had this horrified, both of my teachers, because Dolores Spitzer was on that jury and Robert Hopkins, and they just, her jaw was dropped. When I got up and I said, I'm out of here. I know I'm gone, And then when I ended up with whatever, I think it was a B-, it was the lowest you could get where you wouldn't have to, repeat it or something.
I see.
And so they said, we just couldn't believe it that, you got through it, somehow ended, I know where we're supposed to end. So,
Well, I'm going to leapfrog a bit. If you think about what you learned in those classes, in that environment compared to what you might have learned on the Woody Herman band, can you compare and contrast that?
well, I mean, I'm really glad that I had that preparation. And when I got with Woody's band, which was my first real, I would say, real professional gig, with some kind of, people, noticing it, and you had to be on your toes. I at least had the background to do the reading, and I knew enough tunes. There was a little initiation test that Woody had, because there were some charts that were fake, the rhythm section. So my first gig, which, all the cynical guys I had just gotten out of the Army. So I was just the happiest guy with my short hair to be on Woody Herman's band. And some of the guys would say, oh, we were playing like an Elks Club or something. It's my first gig, one of those things. And the guys were saying, oh, every night's a jazz festival, So we go into this Elks Club, and people had said, yeah, don't bother to say hello to Woody or whatever, just do the gig and whatever. And so Joe LaBarbera, who had gotten me on the gig, said, oh, by the way, some of the charts, like, there's no rhythm charts on like Satin Doll and A-Train. He said, do you know those Duke Ellington intros on those? And I said, yeah, pretty much I can, I could do it on, Satin Doll or whatever. He said, good, because like Woody will just count it off, and that's what you do for the intro. And not knowing it's like really the initiation test, the first tune with Woody Herman, he just like walked on and kind of had a look at me. There's a new piano player, number 300 or whatever. And he says, Satin Doll, intro, 1, 2. And I went, da, 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 da. And it's like, I looked at Joe LaBarbera and was like, okay, you'll be on the gig, I think, so,
Nice.
so I guess if you just played a 1-6-2-5 or something, whatever, or 1, 4, 3, 6, even, wouldn't have made it.
I see. That's so fascinating that how musicians get plugged into those bands. Like there's no rehearsal. It's like, you're thrown into the fire and you hope you survive, I guess.
And the guy who recommended you, his ass is on the line. So Joe
Oh,
LaBarbera's ass is, yeah, so that's when I got the gig with Liza Minnelli for a while, which is 1979, which I was definitely like the 15th call or something, because they had asked Lawrence Feldman, my friend, they got to the saxophones to ask about piano players. And so Lawrence Feldman recommended me. So, when a saxophone player is recommending you, that they've gone down the list, the people, but all these guys were studio guys in New York and didn't want to travel. So I got a chance to do that, to get very well paid for a little while, and see some show business,
Did you have to be ready to play songs that you knew in different keys with Liza or with female singers?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was part of the fun for me. At the beginning, I was not a very good transposer. I used to, if I knew that I had to do it, I would write out a quick lead sheet, or at least the chords and other keys. But then it got to be where most of the tunes I knew well enough that, especially if there was a chart, I mean, it was not a problem. But I remember one night with Liza, there was an intro, I gave her a D7, and we used to just want, because she could be very spontaneous and funny, but the show was very scripted. So it was the same every night. When something would happen, like when the part of the stage would fall down and she'd ad lib we just love it. So, and she was very cool that way. She was, she really very, very cool. And then one night I gave her the D7, which was supposed to go to There's a there's a someone to watch
Oh,
over me or something, I think
mm-hmm.
in G. So I gave her whatever the chord was, and she went into another tune in G. And I was right there. And that was another case where, I guess I was the musical director was panicking, but Liza was winging it. She was taking a slight liberty, and thank goodness I knew the tune. So
Wow.
yeah. So, but I mean, I mean, most singers had charts, and it would be. I remember Anita O'Day was a bit difficult because she would do verses and just really run right through the verse. And I wouldn't have the words. It would be a tune I didn't know the
Oh,
words to the verse. And she'd have like somebody had done maybe a lead sheet with the melody, but that's not what she did. She was just running right through it to get to whatever it was. And so finally, I just told her, like, because she was screaming at me, like, whatever Anita would scream. And I was bold enough to kind of scream back. And I just said, just tell me the word you want the chord on. I'll be there, So we actually did that. So it's like the word, whatever, okay, chord here. And so, so I could catch her on the word rather than try to read this thing and she's running through it. And then, oh, we're already in the tune, So,
wow.
so yeah, so those were, that was one of the more difficult things, but it got resolved. Somebody just sent me I went to Brazil with Anita O'Day, and somebody just sent me an audio of it. I could send it to you. And she's doing a lot of ballads. It's kind of interesting. I guess it's 1984. And she's not in the greatest shape, vocally, but there are times when it was magic, it was really, I mean, because the time and whatever, that was her thing. And that was one of the more difficult gigs that I did because she was in a certain place, I think, in her life. And then I think things got a little better for her after that.
Mhm.
So
Playing for singers, did that bear fruit when you started playing for Chet Baker and Lee Konitz? They're both
I
such great melodists.
I guess like the time with Chet, which was right after Woody Herman, was just the first time I played with him. The first few years when I was on the road, didn't do the records that he was doing at that point because that was a CTI sort of thing that he was involved with. So they used Bob James and whoever was the house rhythm section. But that was an education because he sang and played. He did everything. And previous to that, I'd done some singers in Ohio. I worked with Maureen McGovern when she was a kid. She was a singer in the group, but she was pretty folk oriented in her own way. She played guitar and sang. But I remember, and I think she credits me with it. I turned her on to Spring Can Really Hang You Up the Most. I said, you got to learn this tune,
Mm.
And so I think she acknowledged me for that one time when I saw her 20, 30 years ago. She says, yeah, you're the one that brought that tune up. So I, other than her and a few, good singers back in Ohio, it was Chet who really set me up for anything that I would learn later on about accompanying, because his stuff was just so straightforward, and it was the right stuff all the time, And even when his chops on trumpet weren't there, he'd sing the next phrase, or he'd sing and then play the trumpet, and it just sounded like the same.
Wow.
The atmosphere was there, and that's what he said. He sang just to set the mood. Basically, that's the only reason he said he sang. He wanted to set that mood, and then kind of retain that mood for those 8 minutes or whatever. And that was important for me to understand, to not play, try to play everything I know on a ballad or something. Just like stay there and then let the next tune be its thing too.
I see. Was did you have a career choice dilemma early on? I'm backtracking a bit, but was there a point as a young man where you had something else you considered doing besides being a professional musician?
Hmm. Well, early on in high school, I was fairly good at writing. I was a fairly decent journalist. Uh, and and I had good teachers in Brookfield High School, give them a plug, in Ohio. But so it was kind of expected. And I did music on my own because I wasn't in marching band or anything, because when you're a pianist, you do that. And then eventually I joined the chorus because there were some nice looking girls and whatever, I thought I could say hi and have the hope of whatever. And so, but other than chorus, some of the teachers didn't even know what I played. so there was an expectation that I might go into journalism and whatever. But I always felt that writing was hard for me. I could do it pretty well, and it served me very, very well in especially my academic career when I was the chairman at Eastman for 11 years, and whatever, and had to write certain things. And even like I've written some articles and whatever, so I can write, but it's a lot of effort for me. Even like the liner notes that I did for I do them sometimes for records just so that I can get people on the track. Because sometimes the liner notes, when they're written by somebody who has another agenda, I might not focus the listener the way I might want to. So sometimes I write my own liner notes. So that was the possibility. But early on, like from getting those paying gigs, I realized I could do this. And I realized that it was better than working in the mill. My dad had got me a job my first summer after I started college in the mill. And between the loudness of the sound and and you could take home some money at that time from working in the mill compared to other things, but it was just so loud and so hard. And I saw how hard my dad worked running a hand crane and by a blast furnace. I said, this is not for me. And that was exactly his intention. Like I did 6 weeks and I just said, okay, that's a real eliminated possibility. And then, the thing with my parents was like, get a degree, teach music, like my brother Joe, so you get out doing that. So teaching was kind of another option that I had as I got towards the end of my college career and did my student teaching, actually, I said, kind of eliminated that possibility. Had to do lesson plans. And then the lesson plans were never like what was going on.
Right.
I did this lesson plan. I'm winging it here,
Which is worse, a blast furnace or junior high music class?
Yes, exactly. And so I said, I better, I remember I was just kind of learning the diminished scale. I said, I better get to work on this stuff,
Uh-huh.
And so I took my chances by not getting a teaching gig, and I got my draft notice right away in 1969. So I auditioned in Indianapolis, figuring that's close enough to Ohio. Maybe I can, hang in there, 6-hour drive and whatever. And the guy in Indianapolis was very great. He had me sit in. The audition was sitting in with his big band, and he said, you play too well. You don't want to come and be in a fort band. He said, the only thing the Army can offer you is a location. I went, okay. He said, if you ever wanted to go to Europe, wanted to go, to travel someplace. I said, is there anything in New York? And he said, oh yeah, there are bands in New York. So he made a call to his Staten Island band. It was a fort band located in Staten Island. They said they had openings. They had actually, the officers really weren't running it. It was like an enlisted guy that answered the phone. They already had like 4 or 5 piano players, but he said yes. So I got the chance to go to Fort Wadsworth in Staten Island, and after basic training, and kind of get into this band that already had these piano players, so and great, really wonderful musicians at that time. So that was a kind of a continuation of my education. Near the end of my Army career, another option came about when, because at the end of it was 1972, and there was a lot of, that the anti-war thing, whatever that was going on, and the people that were getting out of the Army was suddenly allotting money to train people in a trade. So I said, oh, wow, piano tuning. Maybe I can get a piano tuner or whatever. So there was a thing where they said, well, you already have a degree in whatever in music. I said, oh, I got to get into a trade, whatever, you know. So I went on the lookout for a piano tuner. And then there was somebody that had done woodwind repair with Saul Fromkin in New York. There was a woodwind repair man that was very, very, very well known. And so I called Saul asking if he knew any piano tuners that I could do. He said, you know, you should do woodwind repair. Of course, he's going to get some money from the Army to train me. And I said, well, I don't really play the woodwinds, you know, like he said, it's better. It's like you'll be scientific or whatever. So I went in and I learned how to repair woodwinds. I was pretty awful at it. I was very slow, but I could, Saul entrusted me to repair some student metal clarinets now and then, you know. And once it gave me an open hole flute, which took me, I mean, forever to repad. But anyway, so I had some skill going there, which actually served me well in Woody Herman, because Tom Anastas, who was the baritone player, used to warm up Woody's horn. And there was something wrong. I don't know what Tom might have done with the horn, but there was one time where it got a little bit out of line. And I was able to look at it enough and get it so Woody would know there was something wrong, but it wasn't horrible, like, you know, that anyone had thrown it or anything. So, but when I got back to New York, there was the idea that maybe I would do this, you know, this woodwind repair thing in addition to trying to make my way. So I did, but one of those things, again, it was harder than writing for me. I mean, you know, when I talk about repairing woodwinds, I have no innate mechanical skills. So it was just, I did a few things on my own, and then, you know, started just getting back into teaching privately. And that's kind of what I did for most of my New York career. I just taught a lot until a couple institutions came along, Manhattan School of Music in the 80s, and they were forming a jazz department, and I was able to be on the ground floor of that. And then some other things that came my way, some adjunct things and some independent studies. So I was always able to kind of juggle the playing with my private students at that time.
What do you consider in the 70s going into the 80s as really important musical associations for yourself? Playing gigs and recording, perhaps.
Well, definitely, you know, when I, you know, my Chet Baker Association, which went to about 1976 or so. And then during that time, I also met Lee Konitz and started playing with him. There was a place called Stryker's Pub on West 86th Street. So I met Lee Konitz, and that was very influential. I had actually met Lee Konitz initially at Saul Fromkin's, where he was a customer of Saul Fromkin's, but that was not, you know, I met him as a woodwind repairman, but then I met him later on, and actually in the park walking our dogs, because we were close to Central Park. I lived on the Upper West Side, but he lived right across the street from Stryker's, where I was playing a couple nights with Chet Baker, and then I started playing a couple nights with Lee. Don Elliott started playing there. He's a mellophone player, and so I started playing. Well, I was playing there because my electric piano was there. My Fender Rhodes was in residence. So it was a horrible Fender Rhodes, but it was in residence there. So I did a lot of gigs at Stryker's. And so that was very, very, you know, very good for me. And a lot of people do remember that club because it was pretty intimate. And, you know, it was a chance to go hear Lee Konitz in a trio. And he was pretty low profile at that point. You know, I mean, he wasn't, well, it was before he formed the Nonette. Then that was, you know, he started getting some ideas about, you know, reasserting himself on the scene, I think. But he was not doing a whole lot other than these little gigs at Stryker's, and then maybe going out and doing whatever he did as a solo, you know, act, picking up musicians. Then from that, you know, my peers, Gregory Herbert, great saxophonist that I became friends with Woody Herman. We had a group that we tried to organize. So there's a, you know, bunch of my contemporaries, Jimmy Madison, a great drummer in that time. So always trying to have little gigs of our own. And then it was Gregory who recommended me to Thad and Mel. And I'd known Mel from I think he did a week with Chet Baker that I was on. So I had this shot to play with Thad Jones, and the first gig I did with them was a quartet gig, Joyous Lake up in, I think, Woodstock, New York, something like that. And it was Sam Jones on bass, Mel Lewis, me, and Thad. And it was like, wow, you know, it was just amazing. And so Thad said something like, "We've been looking for somebody for the band, you know, whatever." And I was like, and I truthfully didn't know a whole lot about Thad Jones' Mel Lewis band. I knew Thad as a player. I knew his 5x5, the Monk records that he did, and also what he did early on with Mingus, the jazz experiments of Charles Mingus, where, you know, so I knew Thad's playing. I didn't really know his writing, but I guess I comped in the places that was good, you know. So anyway, I had a shot to do the big band, and Mel Lewis gave me a heads up on what charts they were doing, so I didn't have to go in and sight read on a Monday. I had the charts over the weekend or something, and then Mel said, "Well, you know, we're going to do this one, and we're not going to do this. Don't worry about that." Or he said, "Oh, make sure you look at the ending of this one." So I had a little coaching from Mel. So that was the way I went in on my first Monday and did the big band, and that was a revelation. Like now, I mean, the more I you know, sometimes when I go out to a college and do these Thad Jones charts, I was just trying to be the piano player, you know. But now I just totally appreciate what Thad, you know, what he did with that band, and you know, and it had also to do with Mel, because that whole chemistry of the way Mel played with that band. I played that music with other people, with other drummers and Mel, and it's really like, you know, not quite, you know.
Not quite.
So
That was we wore those records out in college,
yeah,
and still, like, what's the Jerome Richardson tune?
Groove Merchant.
Groove Merchant. Oh my man, that's like graduate school for saxophone players, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's this, like, I mean, it's everything, and the freedom I had, you know, because I came into a place where the first pianist was Hank, so there was not a lot written for piano. What I just did a clinic where we talked about one of those charts, "Don't Get Sassy," and what I explained to some students was that Sam Herman was the original guitar player in the band. And those charts look like guitar charts because they got every chord, because Sam is playing 4 to the bar on a lot of those things. And piano players don't play all that, you know. So, right. But Hank was the first piano player. So there's a lot of times in what Thad had originally have C7. Okay, well, what, then you hear the band play something, and said, I better just play the 3rd and the 7th, you know, because you know, and then figure out what Thad's doing. So that was the name of the game. And then if it looked like one of those, the charts that came out on Hal Leonard that are basically copies of what Sam Herman probably did for the rhythm section, but basically what the guitar was doing in those early charts. Yeah, just don't try to play all that, because like you'll be in the way, you know. So, but Thad,
I feel sorry sometimes for high school piano players. They get these charts and there's all this piano stuff in the jazz band chart, and you feel like, you know, I've said this in the past, and it's not really fair. Like, just play half of that. Well, which half? You know, like, that's not really fair to them either, but it's so overwritten.
Yeah, and sometimes it'll be a 2-staff thing with all the voicings written out, which is nice, you know. But then it will go to like some chord, you know, like some single staff with some slashes in it, you know. So it's like really, it's one of those things where it comes down to your ears and listening to it, and then seeing where you might fit with that. I would find things where, say, I would come across, like the band would be very tooty, and then maybe I'd come across where I'd play a bell tone, and Thad would like, you know, kind of grunt. It's like, keep that in. so that became like a part, like inventing a part,
Uh-huh.
that I would play. And then when I started strumming, Thad gave me a nice grunt. I think I started strumming on "That's a Freedom," #1 in the book. That's a Hank Jones chart, and I just started strumming 4 to the bar because there was no guitar there. And Thad grunted, I keep that in. So that became like a little signature that I did that, Roland Hanna before me and nobody did, and Jim McNeely after me didn't do. So that little thing that I did that got the grunts, like keep that in, because, it kind of just maybe reminded him of maybe the early days of the band.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a sort of a open-ended question. In your own recordings, in your own live concerts, can you tell me what you realistically hope a listener gets from your playing?
Wow, that's a very good question. I hope they get that I'm involved in that particular piece and that atmosphere of that piece, and like trying to play from inside the music, and whatever that suggests, to try to keep it in that realm. And if the music is really crazy or outside, well, you play whatever. But if you're playing a ballad, or if you're playing something to have a contrast within it, and then to for the person to really think, okay, this is good for that moment. This is like, I'm enjoying what I'm hearing for that time. And so like from playing inside the piece and exploring what's there, and trying to put some signature on it, but not trying to just impose everything that I might have practiced, because that just doesn't work for me. And for some guys, they come in and they can nail that, whatever it is. But it kind of goes back a little bit to Chet Baker too, where he would kind of, if he heard somebody that was just, playing a lot of technique, he kind of like, what's that all about? Sort of, what's that have to do with what we started out with? So to keep it within that. And I think that the listener should have a good experience with it, and and I, like doing things too long, doing things, I'm very conscious of that, and so I want to somehow include the listener. I'm not sure that I always do it, but the intent is there.
Would you ever, during an improvised solo on a standard tune, would you ever play a snippet of the melody, perhaps, to remind the audience, here's where we are, or I don't know, something like that?
Yeah, sometimes in some tunes, just to remind myself too, to get back to see where, where I am. And I think keeping the melody close is very important. And it also, it's a reference point. And if you can develop that, Lee Konitz had this kind of 1 to 10, or the thing where if you're playing the melody, that's #1. And if you're playing something that's totally unlike the melody, if you're playing bebop, maybe that's #5 or #6. And if you're playing really abstractly, that's #10, but you're still playing the tune. So Lee was very specific about saying, yeah, you should be able to play jazz at #2 and #3. That still sounds like jazz, because a lot of people just have their prepared lick repertoire or whatever. And so they play the melody and then they go into whatever. And he said they're jumping from maybe #1 to #6. And it's like, so how do you, but, and so there's a thing that I'm on with Lee, it's called Portrait of a Saxophonist as an Artist. It's a video that we did in Canada. And Lee's trying to get this, I don't know if it's a flute player, to play something close to the melody, because he could play these other things. And when he played close to the melody, it didn't sound like jazz. it just sounded suddenly stiff. And so that's the point of that. And then funny in that video, the next thing goes to Lee playing very abstractly on Stolen by Starlight or something like that. Just the most, but Lee had me singing Lester Young solos and Louis Armstrong. Like I basically did not study with Lee, but in the course of rehearsing, I got a lot of the things that he taught people, and he was very insistent on. Like Lee once told me I don't know, we're playing All the Things You Are or something. And he accused me of using too much technique. And I said, man, you want chops? There's 100 guys in New York. I didn't say this, but I'm thinking like, you want chops? I don't, I'm like not one of the chop guys. There's guys that will play rings around me, you want chops. And so Lee said, well, you should basically be able to play a good solo with one finger. And he'd be like, whatever it was, so, okay, yeah, so one of the things I have to remind myself of, it came really in handy once, because the first time I played Carnegie Hall with Chet Baker, first time in Carnegie Hall, I remember we were playing Tidal Breeze, my tune. And I looked down and my knee was going up and down. I had this nervous thing. And I thought of that thing that Lee, I said, I know my tune. I can just kind of play the melody, I could play really close and, and just let the rhythm section groove. And then my knee calmed down and I was able to, but it's like one of those little nervous things that like the tick that you could define your career, but so that thing of being able to play it and have it sound like it's jazz, but very simple. It's really, it's hard. And it's like, I want to show what I can do sometimes, even at, my age, but, sometimes it's just like, let it be, like especially if you've got great players playing with you, you can lean on that, and sometimes we don't.
Right. The better your accompaniment, your fellow musicians, oftentimes the less you can get away with playing, it seems like.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're a Stravinskyite, I think I can say.
I think so, yeah.
Maybe we could talk a bit about this your release here. All right. So you were very inspired by The Rite of Spring, and I want to read. You said that you do fairly well with writing, although it might be a chore for you. I wanted to read this thing in your liner notes. This is a quote. Smart-ass that I am, when once asked what my favorite song was by a local newspaper reporter, I replied, The Rite of Spring. And according to you, you saved the shoes that you wore to Stravinsky's funeral service.
Yeah.
That's
pretty obsessive. Yeah. No, I realized it was 1971, like when he passed. I mean, and I was still in the Army, and a bunch of us guys were really into like contemporary music, and some guys had really studied Stravinsky, and I just knew it was the passing of a great. I didn't know, and I mean Coltrane. I missed that one, but there's something about Stravinsky passing that just I said I gotta get in line here. And I, paid my respects, and yeah, I did save the shoes. The shoes were very uncomfortable. They were kind of a work boot looking thing that was kind of suede from the 60s or something, and they were never comfortable, but I kept them, and finally, I think a yard sale, I don't know, somebody got them.
Okay. They didn't know what they were getting.
Yeah, maybe somebody's running, and he's wondering why he's going
Why is it going like that when I walk?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really good. Well, I have a couple comments about the recording, which I really liked, which I think can stand by itself as a recording, or you can listen to it with the Rite of Spring in mind. And I wonder if did you have that in mind, or were you really trying to reflect Stravinsky as close as you could?
No, the thing I realized with the quartet, especially we had a little rehearsal in Argentina. We got a chance to play again together. We hadn't played for some years, and I realized that it was going to have a personality of its own, and it wasn't like I could assign, these guys to like, okay, we're all going to listen to the Rite of Spring, and then you come in with all the licks you can't, we're going to just do this. It wasn't that. And I knew my fingers aren't on all the notes there. I'm just trying to grab things sometimes to refer to Stravinsky. So that's the way I wrote it for them. I wanted them to be who they are. And with Rich Perry's going to be Rich Perry, and we hire him because of his great sound, and you're going to know it's him, regardless of the music. And so that was especially after we had our little rehearsal. I just said, this is going to go the way it's going to go. And I'm just going to try to give some suggestions, which we did. And then we left out some things. There were just some things that when we rehearsed on the day of the recording, just like, okay, that ain't going to work. Okay. And we needed to leave room for improvisation. So it wasn't like I was going to be literal and try to play the whole score. And then there's just things like, even that thing, there's no way I was going to play that exactly, because it could be played and I know it, but I spaced it out in some way, just like gave a suggestion. So basically the comments from people I really respect have been very, very, very good. I'm very pleased because I think they got my idea, and the fact that I wasn't going to just try to play the score, And
can I ask you what that chord is?
Oh yeah, it's an E triad in the left hand and an E flat 7 in the right hand.
You got it surrounded.
You got it surrounded, yeah. There's a wonderful YouTube clip that's been looped of Stravinsky playing it. If you've ever seen it, it's been looped, and Stravinsky, it's like 8 minutes of Stravinsky playing that chord, and it's on a loop, but he's just enjoying it so much, and it's just like he loved that chord. And then that sort of thing occurs later, because you got in a different key, you've got like the D7 on top. The last one, you got an E flat 7. You got an E flat 7 in the bottom and a D7 on top. So it's that sound that he's really intrigued with. Just theoretically, nerd theory wise, I've seen this one other place, but my thing with it, I think it's a 5-7 and a 6-7 chord of A flat harmonic minor, because you got an E flat 7.
Okay.
But it's very, I've heard other explanations of it, but, I get my fingers on that. All those notes are in A flat harmonic minor from the, whatever you want to call it, the flat 6 mode or the.
Did Stravinsky, could he hear all that in his head, do you think?
I think so. There's stories about him conducting in the wrong notes that he didn't catch in the, in the score and whatever. The thing that I've been reading about him, he did compose a lot at the piano. And there's one thing he wrote on the one of the recordings that he conducted. He said that the last dance of Rite of Spring, the sacrificial dance, he could play it before he could write it down. So that's kind of interesting. He was improvising, that sort of thing. That kind of thing. He's just like, having fun, maybe. I don't know. It's a special kind of thing in 1912. I don't know. Nobody else was doing that.
When you, I've had the experience of hearing The Rite of Spring live twice,
Mhm.
and both times I felt like I'd been like either uh, run through a washing machine and hung up to dry, and all these like, and so I was really surprised to come across from his 1936 autobiography, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but he said, I consider that music is by its very nature essentially powerless to express anything at all.
I know.
Expression has never been an inherent property of music. Well, really?
Pretty wild state. I remember, reading that a long time ago, and okay. I mean, it's the way he. I mean, I think it's like he's like at that point, he's friends with Ravel. He's friends with Debussy. A lot of those kind of harmonies are present in Debussy, a little less functional, and Ravel almost functional. But Stravinsky puts the rhythmic element on it and kind of, I forget what they call, he isolates these sounds away from a context of harmony. And I think that's like rather than being totally atonal, when I found some of these things, it's like, wow, they're beautiful. There's like a thing where it goes. It's just a dominant seventh, chord, and then it starts that. I mean, there's just like there's a dominanty function, but it, so I mean, I think the thing with jazz is the diminished scale, the octatonic scale, whatever you want to call it. There's so much of that in it, and I think that appeals to jazz musicians because there's so much of that sort of half whole, whatever, and the diminished relationships. And so the architecture of the piece is something I found over time that's just fascinating to me. The way he uses things or just morphs them a little bit in the next, in another movement, things come back. And so at first, I just thought, oh, well, this is wonderfully random, crazy stuff. How did he think of this? And then it's like, as I studied it more and more, it's like, yeah, that's why it works, because we've maybe heard a little premonition of it someplace, and so he sets us up for that. And it's a wild experience. I mean, especially like with the tempos, my wife got me cognizant of this. I've heard some renditions of The Rite of Spring. The one that I got originally was on Antal Dorati, Minneapolis Symphony, and the tempos are swinging. And then there's some where the tempos are a little bit, not so hot or something, because I've collected a bunch of scores. And my wife is the one that said, well, for the dancers, maybe the stuff that I like, the dancers, maybe it's too fast for the dancers. And as it got to become a concert piece more than a dance piece, because I've never seen the whole dance. I don't think I've even seen it online, but the tempos might have to be a little bit slower for the dance to take place, because it's very heavy dancing too. It's
it's fascinating to think that the dance was I guess, impetus for the music, but now the music like does it all.
Oh yeah. Well, I think he got more into, as it became a concert piece. He said things about the choreography and whatever. He was like, he had his opinions. He didn't have a great opinion of Bartok, which I know. Wow. I'm trying not to take offense because I love Bartok, but he had very little good to say about some other composers. So, but that was him.
Have you ever wished you could go back, like in a time machine, and be in attendance at a particular musical event?
Oh, that one for sure.
Yeah.
And I even thought, like, when I had some, grandiose idea of like, wow, there should be a movie of this, opening night and whatever. And I think there is one from the last 10 or so years. There is some fictionalized movie of of that opening night. But I thought, what an amazing thing to be part of. But I think on the other level, supposedly he took the forehand thing to Debussy's house, and Debussy's sight read. So I mean, that was the level. The level was insane.
Yes.
Plus, I think there's some stuff that Stravinsky really gets from Ravel that are in the Rite of Spring. There's a piece called Alborada del Gracioso that Ravel did in 1905, and I'm convinced that had to be under Stravinsky's fingers in some way, because there's just like some remnants that wind, they're in there somewhere. They're Stravinskyized, but like the pieces that he knew, and I know he was, from what I've read, that he was pretty close with Ravel and close enough with Debussy that he wrote Symphonies for Winds too, which is another great piece as a tribute to Debussy. It doesn't sound at all like Debussy, And then we get to the Ebony Concerto, which he, that's his impression of Woody Herman, I guess. I mean, it's unbelievable.
I had the good fortune to interview Chubby Jackson.
Oh boy,
and he talked about that session trying to play, and Stravinsky's up there, and Chubby's like, they were so, I think, challenged by that experience.
Well, hopefully that's the spirit I'm bringing, even when I do my gig tomorrow night. It ain't going to be perfect. And one of the inspiring things, I talked about a few things in the liner notes that inspired me. But when I first heard, because I'd heard denigrating things about the Woody Herman version of Ebony Concerto. Okay, everyone, and then I got one of these CD collections that had it there and had some photos of Stravinsky with the guys, and Stravinsky's got his little like PF Flyer looking shoes on, and the guys are all dressed up. So Stravinsky's rehearsing that, with these guys, and they performed it, I think, more than once, and it's ragged as hell, but it's great. It's got the spirit. It's got something of that thing that the enthusiasm for the music that's there. Leonard Bernstein, in one of the nice YouTube clips where he's teaching Rite of Spring to some young people, a great young people's orchestra, I think in Germany somewhere, says that it's like it should be played by young people. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got that energy. And Stravinsky was 29, so it is a young work, and when it's played maybe over perfectly, it loses some of that edge. So I'm definitely bringing that into it.
Yeah.
It ain't going to be perfect.
Yeah. Congratulations on the recording. And we're approaching about an hour. I have just a couple more things I want to ask you. And
sure.
2 questions about playing with other people. Have you ever had an experience, like you talk about Rich Perry, and he'll play who Rich Perry is. Have you ever had to ask a horn player or someone in your trio or quartet to play differently?
I think not so much professionally. I used to have a thing with bass players about playing on top of the beat or something, which I'm not, I mean, that's not the way I think of it now. But I used to, sometimes if somebody was dragging, I'd want them to liven it up a little bit, So that was more of a general thing. I think what I've told and some student saxophone players, especially ones who are terrific technicians and have a lot of chops, is like, put some mystery into it. Like, I'm not getting, and they used to, I think one of my groups at Eastman, what do they call it? Dr. Dankbrain and the Mysteriosos or something. Cause I used to say, make it more mysterious. Miles makes it mysterious. Wayne Shorter makes it mysterious. You don't really know what they're going to do. And so sometimes if on the first chorus, you're giving out everything. And then that second chorus, there's like, it kind of sounds a little bit like that. Then they're getting the idea that you're not organically growing something. So even if you're faking it, if you're, because you know what you're going to play, but you just kind of hold off a little bit, it sounds more organic. So that's been the thing I've told people, to just kind of don't play everything, just space it out a little bit. And even compositionally, it's the same thing. It's like, you write, and I write these things, they sound like etudes and whatever. So, okay, maybe what if we left some notes out here or there? Or what if I've gotten to the point now where rather than play that thing where you play the head and then you play your solos in the head, I feel like, if I'm going to play a standard, maybe I'll play that tune somewhere in the course of the 6 minutes, maybe in the middle, or maybe I'll fragment it. But, like you said, like you give a hint, or you let the audience know you're playing that tune, but not just do that format thing. So you kind of leave it a little more mysterious, and then you create something where it's hopefully satisfying because you're giving it that, but you're just not giving it in the way that you see it. And I'm kind of doing that with my own pieces too. Sometimes, and I feel I can do that with my own music. I don't have to play head solo head. Yeah. I could play anything. I could play it any way I want, because it's my tune.
Excellent. Yeah, you anticipated one of my questions, and it was about bass players. So I'm going to just wrap up with, you were at Eastman for 11 plus years, and
19, actually.
19. That's a big plus.
Yeah.
And you dealt with basically what I'll describe as the cream of young musicians.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of advice could you give them entering the music field over the years, which you could say I'm not incorrect in this, but it seems like every 5 so years certain things go away, perhaps to be replaced by something else. But what kind of practical advice could you offer these young people?
Well, it's interesting now because so much has changed in the last year with COVID and everything, and people are finding their way. The students I'm still in touch with are finding ways to teach online, to get their stuff out there in some way. I think the hardest thing is how music seems to be given away, and people put it online, and then it's up there. It's like it's gone, And I mean, I used to, think of like hopes of an ASCAP royalty, whatever. And I've gotten a little bit with those, and I've gotten awards and whatever you get. And it's not, it's not a whole lot, but it's still something that has your work protected in some way. And the advice that I would give, and since I'm not really actively teaching now, is you've got to be tech savvy, which I'm not, and you've got to understand also how to protect yourself. If you want to have a career doing this, there's when you're doing what you love, you might not be able to do anything else. That's what I find for myself. But if you're going to do it, you've got to find a way that balances, the rest of your life, whatever you've got, family and whatever your obligations are, and the fact that you want some future there too. One of the ways I was able to retire is I had a small pension from playing a bunch of hotel cocktail piano that I hadn't forgotten about, but I'd got invested in the union in New York by doing, not Broadway shows or record dates, but just playing solo piano, playing my music really quietly to people that weren't listening, and playing Wayne Shorter and practicing and doing whatever. And now it kind of offsets most of the health insurance that I'm dealing with. But those kind of things, I never thought of that. But, from doing gig after gig, which I came up in a time when I was playing 5 or 6 nights a week, sometimes 7, and then teaching. I don't know how to give advice on how to do something like that, because I don't know that the venues, I know that right now they don't exist. We're hoping some of them come back. It seems like the pay scale is the same as it was in 1970, but that's another whole story. But I think, the people that want to do it somehow make their way. And it's very, it can be very precarious, but if you love it, you'll find a way to keep doing it.
Well said. So thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Monk.
And
I'm really happy to do this.
yes, I'm going to pause our recording here and then we'll talk some more about Stravinsky.
Okay.